Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar in the Science Behind Animal Behavior series, where we'll be focusing on animal-assisted interventions. Now, to introduce our speaker for today, we are very excited to welcome Dr. Aubrey Fine, who received his graduate degree from the University of Cincinnati and has been on the faculty of the California State Polytechnic University since 1981. His leadership among faculty and teaching excellence earned him the prestigious Wang Award in 2001, given to a prestigious professor within the California State University system, which has 23 universities. In this instance, for exceptional commitment, dedication, and exemplary contributions within the area of education and applied sciences. Dr. Fine is also a licensed psychologist who opened his practice in Southern California in 1987. His practice specializes in treating children with ADHD, learning disabilities, developmental disorders, and parent-child relations. Dr. Fine is the author of several books, including The Therapist's Guide to Learning and Attention Disorders and the Handbook on Animal-Assisted Therapy. He has also been a guest on numerous national TV and radio shows, including on programs on ABC, Animal Planet, Discovery Network, KTLA, and CNN. It is hence our pleasure to have him as a speaker at our webinar today. Before we begin, a gentle reminder to please mute your microphones and post any questions that you may have to the user named Q&A. This can be done throughout the session. Thank you. Dr. Fine, please. You have to unmute your microphone first. You're unmuted.
I did it again.
Yep.
Okay. How wonderful it is to see all of you today. And for me, it's you're yesterday and you are my tomorrow. So it's wonderful to share this morning with you. And although our remarks will be somewhat brief, I'd like to go through with you a little bit of my perceptions of animal-assisted interventions and where we some reason. Okay, so one of the things I just really want to talk about today is really how do we shape the future of animal-assisted intervention. And I have been involved in this field since the early years. And in fact, I've been doing this work since the early 1970s. And we'll talk more about that. I think these two pictures here are a lovely testimony of what we're going to be talking about initially, which is the human-animal bond, and then moving into the animal-assisted interventions. And the dog to the left is a dog that really changed the lives of many, and her name was Magic. The picture on the bottom is a gentleman in New York City, and you could just see that connection that he has with his animal. And one of the things that we're going to try to balance in our conversation today is how science is now bridging the gap and confirming what many of you here today, I really believe, have thought about over the years. And you've thought about this intuitively, that science has only complemented what we're talking about, which is that animals in our lives are really good for our well-being. So as we begin our discussion, I really want to try to connect the dots. And sometimes when I do talks like this, I borrow the concept of connecting the dots from Steve Jobs, where he used that concept in a wonderful lecture that he gave at Stanford University many, many years ago, that he said it was easier sometimes to understand the future by connecting the dots from the past. And I think it's important to recognize the history, and part of that history relates to our understanding of this thing called the human-animal bond. So rather than leap right into animal-assisted interventions, I felt it was really important to get all of you to sort of be on the same equal ground and really understand a little bit about what the human-animal bond represents as a term. I'm sure many of you already experience the human-animal bond on a daily basis, but to also recognize how the field has evolved since the time that the terminology came out. So, you know, when we talk about the human-animal bond, it's amazing that a lot of people don't realize that, number one, the term human-animal bond was borrowed really from the literature that captured the spirit of the term infant-parent bond. And when a group of scholars got together early on, they thought about, how do we talk about this connection between humans and animals? And in fact, the connotation came from that terminology. You need to realize, and this is what's fascinating, is that the literature suggests, and it's pretty clear, that the first time the term was actually used officially was at a proceeding in a meeting that was held in Dundee, Scotland in 1979. So it's amazing that a term that many of us feel is part of our nomenclature in regards to the language that we use in our own lexicon is really relatively young. And so even since then, we even have evolved into a whole field of human-animal interactions, which is called anthrozoology, which is the study of human-animal interactions. But what is the bond? You know what I mean? I think all of us, I wish I could see all of you in person right now. All of us have our own perception of the bond. I love this photo here of this deep connection between this golden and this man. And you can see that connection, that the bond, for it to be truly meaningful, it has to be mutual. It has to have a reciprocal effect on both human and the animal. And I think it's something that we all have to appreciate, because so often when we talk about human-animal interactions, many of you look at this and talk about how it benefits you. But over the collection of years of being surrounded by animals, it really is important for me to recognize that reciprocal relationship and the importance of the meaning of our relationship to the other animal. And as I say that to you, you need to recognize that you're listening to a true changer, so to speak. You're listening to a person that when he grew up as a little boy was afraid of animals. My mother didn't like dogs. She didn't like animals and really discouraged us from interacting. And it was only as years growing up into my adolescence and college years that I really wanted to begin to understand this connection. But the reality is, as a boy growing up, I really didn't have that strong understanding. You know, in my work in studying the human-animal relationships and talking about the bond, you know, I'm very familiar with definitions like the American Veterinary Medical Association's definition of the human-animal bond. And as a scientist, as I said, the key parts are the issue of reciprocal relationships. But as I really began to look at the human-animal bond, when I wrote a book called Our Faithful Companions, one of the things that I struggled with was this notion of our connection. And I know that sometimes people in science don't like to talk about the word love and the commitment that we have towards animals. But I really believe that's an important ingredient. And in my own work, I wrote a little bit about what we call kinship, that I think is a missing ingredient in the definition of human-animal bond. Because for some of us, we don't talk about, when we talk about kin, we talk about our relatives, our grandparents, our mothers, our sisters, our aunts, our uncles, our parents. But sociologists and anthropologists today really agree that kinship can be beyond biological genetic connections, but can be important people in your circle. And for sure, one of the things that I think many of you would agree is how many of us have embraced the relationships that we have had with animals. And I wish I had much more time today to share with you some of these stories that I found in that I wrote about in Our Faithful Companions and in another book called Afternoons with Puppy. But when you look at the history of the human-animal bond, you have to begin to realize that this is not a new concept, although I told you the terminology became popularized in the late 70s. Let's go back 30,000 BC, where we find a mural in a cave in Spain with a dog and a human. On the other hand, if we're looking at the history of our connections with animals, my estimate of human-dog relationships is probably very generous. I'm saying 12,000 years here. People basically can say that we can go back 50,000 1,000 years or further in the relationship or the domestication that we've had with dogs. And that's why when you think of dogs being man's best friend, it's something that we really have to consider. You know, when you think of the prehistoric times, the early years where the pre-canines that we know today were evolving, what we found is that the dogs that were more comfortable in joining our communities, we let them in. Dogs that we felt read our behavior a little bit more, dogs that were more responsive. So in many ways, when we talk about dogs in therapy, of course, the domestication of the dogs over the thousands and thousands of years have made them excellent partners in what we call animal-assisted interventions in general. When you look at it, felines are a bit younger in our relationships, closer to 10,000 years. And horses, in fact, really haven't been domesticated for that long, about 6,000 years. And that's why when you look at horses biologically, they're wired still to consider themselves, they respond to the world as animals that are prey animals. And that's why, again, they have a unique disposition as therapy animals. When we look at human-animal interactions, again, we could spend the whole morning in Singapore right now just talking about the health benefits. But later tonight, you're going to listen to Dr. Nancy G, a friend of mine. And so I really don't want to go into all of the wonderful research that began cultivating, again, after that definition of the 79, Erica Friedman and her work looking at cardiovascular changes. And, you know, as you'll see or hear later on tonight, the notions of not only do we recognize that our relationships with dogs and other animals, but the research initially was on dogs. When we pet animals, what we end up finding out is that our blood pressure can go down. The level of cortisol, our stress hormone, seems to decrease. And in the early 2000s, when Odenthal was the first person to start studying some of the neurotransmitter changes like beta endorphins, dopamine production, and of course, oxytocin. And oxytocin, as many of you know, is what I would call that love transmitter, where you get those sparklies when you see someone you're connected with. And the love that I think that some of us feel towards our companion animals in many ways is, again, similar to the love that we share with our children and relatives that we care about. So again, the term storge, which is a Greek word that looks at familial love, is very relevant. So without, again, stealing that thunder that from what you're going to hear later on tonight, you know, I'll leave you just with a tidbit or a food for thought that in many ways our interactions with animals in general could almost be like a biological spot treatment, that in many ways being around animals is good for our physical health and our well-being. There are many other reasons why people have pets in their lives. I love this picture with this large dog sitting in the lap of a lady. For some of us, it's for pleasure and affection. What was it like years ago in my home when I had 4 dogs and 3 cockatoos and a couple of smaller birds and a bunny rabbit? When I would come home from work, if the dogs weren't all with me, it was like when I drove into the driveway, the dogs would be barking, the birds would be shouting, "He's home!" It felt like my wife is running to the door screaming, "Come on in, honey." And in reality, when you think about it, many of you may recall a TV show in the United States called Cheers. Cheers was a bar in New England. In fact, it was in Boston. And when people went to the bar, in many ways, they didn't go to the bar to drink per se. They went there for camaraderie, that whole notion of companionship and relationships. So many ways, they went to Cheers because everybody knew their name. When I go home on a daily basis, the dogs greet me in a way that lets me know that I'm important and relevant to them. So again, we could talk about the pleasure, the affection. And in fact, if we were interviewing all of you here today, each of you could give me your backstory, why we believe connecting with animals is so important. I'm going to give you an example because I could give you so many examples of the importance of these connections. In the picture here, you're going to get, you see this young girl. Her name is Alexanne, and the Labrador retriever that she is cuddling with right now is Gleason. Many, many years ago, I never actually met Alexanne. I did meet Gleason and Gleason's handler, but many, many years ago in a state in the United States called Oregon, near Portland, Alexanne was actually in the hospital, and Alexanne had cancer. And at that time, they had dogs visiting the hospital with what I will explain later on with animal-assisted activities. And Sue was walking in the hallway one morning, and she was just going into different rooms for a meet and greet with Gleason, and a little girl shouted, "Can he come in to visit me? I love dogs." And Sue said, "Sure." And she came in and they hung out for a little bit, and she made sure that every time she went back to the hospital, Alexanne was on the list of a visitor from Gleason. Well, periodically, when Alexanne left the hospital, Sue kept a relationship with this little girl. And I recall one day they met, and it was right before Valentine's Day, many, many years ago. And Sue said, "Could I pick up Alexanne and take her to a ceramic shop with Gleason, and we'll do a little craft project?" She actually wanted to surprise the parents and have Alexanne make a Valentine's gift for them. But Alexanne was very conscious of having cancer. And so when she went to get ready, she put a little wig on her head and she put a baseball cap on. And then she got in the car with her buddy Gleason and Sue and drove to the shop. And when they were at the shop, Gleason sat very, very patiently and vigilantly with his friend Alexanne. Many children that were sitting at other tables looked. And finally, a couple of kids walked over and said, "Can I pet your dog?" And Alexanne looked up and looked at Sue. And they said, "Well, how old is your dog? And how'd you get your dog to get here? Because we can't take our dogs." And at first, Alexanne didn't want to talk very much. And she said, "He's not my dog. He's her dog. He's my best friend." And then she explained that she had something called cancer. And she got brave enough and took off the cap and took off the wig, showed her little tattoo that you see here. And she told the story of how they met. And then that day, the kids looked and said, "Hey, I don't care if she's not your dog. It's neat that you were able to bring her. And can we sit over here and play with you?" And that was a wonderful day for Alexanne. And I wish I could make this a Cinderella story, but I did say that there are some people have pets and the pets are so meaningful to them. It's a reason for them to persevere every day. And in many ways, Gleason was that for Alexanne. But I wish I could make this a Cinderella story and have an ending that was perfectly wonderful, and that Alexanne beat cancer, but she lived with it, but the end came a lot sooner. And Sue tells me the story the last time that they met. Alexanne was somewhat weak, but she still enjoyed her buddy visiting. And that day, there were lots of wires all over the place with beep sounds, but they let Gleason come in and she embraced her friend. But then it was time for Gleason to leave. And Sue was a little disappointed first because Gleason didn't want to listen. And that was a bit odd, she felt. But eventually he left and they moved on for their day. But 8:20 that night, she got a phone call and Alexanne had passed away. That was the last time they met. The picture that you see on the screen here was the picture that was on a pew of a church, a large blow up. And in the front of the chapel, in the front row, was an empty space where Sue was able to bring Gleason to that ceremony to reflect her life. So I can share with you so many people that have told me the importance that animals have played in their lives. If we move into the field of animal-assisted interventions, these are some of the key people that were very influential. Of course, many of you may recognize Sigmund Freud here. He brought his dog periodically to therapy. This is the person that's well known as sort of the grandfather of animal-assisted therapy, and that was Boris Levinson. And some of you may recognize the other faces here, Sam Ross, Florence Nightingale, the Corsons, and this is Aaron Ketcher. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Boris Levinson, because Boris Levinson discovered animal-assisted interventions totally by accident, almost a similar story that I'm going to tell you about myself, because he was the one that coined this field, and he called it at that time just pet therapy. He was a professor at a university in New York called Yeshiva University, and he also had a clinical practice based in his home. And what happened was, during the afternoon when there were no patients with him, he had his dog Jingles with him. But when the patients came, of course, he didn't know about this field that he was going to father, that he had Jingles leave and go to the other part of the house. But one day a child came to the home, rang the doorbell. Jingles went with him to the door. And before Boris was able to get Jingles to leave, a remarkable thing happened. When they greeted the child, he saw the child become very, very happy. And long story short, as he was telling the mom, hey, maybe I should take Jingles out now. Mom said, can you leave him here and let's see what happens? And Boris was able to witness the youngster begin to talk more and to be engaging. So what you have to realize, that was in the early 1960s. Boris Levinson started to popularize the terminology in the late 60s, early 70s. And in fact, what you have to understand is that what we're having a wonderful meeting about today wasn't always that accepted. In the first meeting that Levinson talked about what we call today animal-assisted interventions in 1961, in fact, was the first time he talked about this. People ridiculed him. They laughed. They came to the session to say, who would bring an animal to therapy? Why would you do that? And in fact, one of the comments that one of my colleagues who was at that meeting heard, how much of your fee does the dog actually collect? So the field has gone through a lot of history. And how did I get involved? Well, I believe that your newspaper in Singapore today or yesterday had a little snippet of this story. But again, remember I told you I was afraid of animals and didn't feel comfortable with them. My history began with the little gerbil that changed my life, not only as a person, because she opened my eyes to the tremendous gifts that animals give us, but equally as relevant, she opened my eyes to this prospect that we today call animal-assisted interventions. I brought her to a program that at that time was a program that I had developed for children with learning disabilities. It was a social skill training program. And I first brought her just because she was my new friend and I wanted to share her with these young children. And as I came to that program, and that was actually in Montreal where I grew up, I was greeted by youngsters that asked lots of questions like, what kind of animal is this? Why was I bringing her to this program? But I never forgot one little boy that looked at me and said, can I hold her? And without knowing all the things I know about today, I looked at him sort of in a quandary, and I said, okay, I'm going to let you do this. Come on over to this corner where we can sit down. I asked him to cross his legs when he sat down on the ground, and I sat right next to him. And I told him that he needed to take his two palms and put them next to his tummy. And then I said I would place gently Sasha in his arms, in his hands. But I did tell him, I said, you got to promise me that you won't move because I don't want to scare her. And then she got into his palms, and as she became more comfortable with that foundation, she began to meander a little bit, and she started going up his tummy, and he smiled. Then she went back into his palms. What I remember the most 48 years later isn't all of these little details, but I remember a little boy looking at me with eyes of pride, saying to me, you see, I promised you I wouldn't move, and I didn't. This was a boy that was today would have been considered a child that had ADHD, and he was really very impulsive. So when we think of the early years of animal-assisted interventions, what do we think about? Well, some people look at it almost like with this cartoon. My therapy is quite simple. I wag my tail, I lick your face until you feel good about yourself. And taking the tongue in cheek out of this a little bit, in some ways, of course, therapy animals can be very valuable in contributing to an environment, making an environment feel safer, making you feel more comfortable. But as you'll learn, as the years have gone on, we have made this field a lot more sophisticated in our work. So what is the spectrum that we can talk about? Well, again, I can share with you some of the literature, but animal-assisted interventions, which was a term that originally was developed by, I'm going to give credit to Kathy Kruger and James Serpell. They used this term in the textbook that I edited called the Handbook in Animal-Assisted Therapy. And now this terminology is accepted worldwide. The International Association of Human-Animal Interactions Organizations, and their white paper, again, has articulated this. 3 branches that we could talk about. The one to the right, as you see, animal-assisted therapy, is more of what I do. It's the work that I do as a professional, in my case, a psychologist, but in a little while, I'll show you that occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech and language therapists, nurses, many disciplines are engaged in this. And this is a much more structured therapeutic interaction that has expected and planned benefits. To the left, we have animal-assisted activities. Animal-assisted activities doesn't mean that they're less impactful, but they're typically done by handlers in the United States. A lot of people that are doing animal-assisted activities are volunteers that may visit nursing homes, hospitals, perhaps bring animals to a university campus to help college students feel more comfortable. Sometimes we see these individuals at crisis response environments. For example, if there was a disaster, sometimes people might find trained therapy animals that will come to crisis response environments. You might see them in libraries, reading with children. Again, this is less formal. It's incorporating animal-assisted interventions, but using less expected goals. But the animals are still very well trained, have what I call the 3 benchmarks: affiliative nature, wanting to interact with humans. Their behaviors are consistent and very reliable. So throughout the spectrum, although there's a difference in goal setting, the animal's training is pinnacle. And of course, the more capable the handler is in interacting with the animal, the better off they are. The middle one is equally as interesting, animal-assisted education. It's the application and the incorporation of animals in a place called school, but it also can be humane education, teaching people about the importance of kindness and interacting more favorably with animals. So again, this picture here kind of reinforces what we've talked about in my travels worldwide. I have seen people employ animal-assisted interventions with various disciplines, and I have been extremely impressed with the methodology and the preciseness and the effectiveness of these treatments. So why do you apply animal-assisted interventions? And as I said, I was going to sort of do a walkthrough with you. Again, if we had questions, what makes dogs better at doing this work? Well, dogs are tremendously capable of reading our nonverbal behavior, because of the way dogs have changed over the thousands and thousands of years. They're very comfortable in interacting with humans. And because of that, in many ways, I see many therapy dogs doing tremendous work. So here we have a picture of animals acting as a social lubricant, which is really the early work of the Corsons and the early work, as I mentioned, of Boris Levinson, who noted that the animals really help ease the tension of therapy. So again, let's go back to one of my therapy animals, if I can make this more practical. This was one of my dogs, and her name was Puppy. Puppy was one of the early therapy dogs that I used. Prior to using dogs, actually, I was using birds and smaller creatures in my work. Puppy came to my office. Probably this is going back 25, 30 years ago. I remember a little girl that was supposed to come in to see me. She was referred because she was selectively mute. She didn't talk, and outside her home. And when she was little, she didn't go to preschool, and the parents didn't think anything of the fact that she didn't speak a lot. But then when she went to school and she wasn't able to talk, they became very concerned. And then I had this serendipitous outcome. Usually when I meet families, I get them to come first as parents, and then I'll meet the child so that I can get to understand what are the concerns. That day they brought their child, and that was unexpected. Puppy was always my office greeter. So she immediately, when the family came in, she went over and greeted the moms and the mom and the dad. And then she went to the little girl and was very persistent in getting that girl to pet and interact with her. And then I signed, because Puppy knew sign language, I signed for her to come back about 6 feet where I was standing. But I looked at the girl, and I could tell that she wanted really badly for Puppy to stay there. And I looked at her and said, honey, all you have to do is say, Puppy, come, please come, or any of those words. And I know that the parents looked at me and said, Doc, this isn't going to happen because our daughter doesn't speak in public. But on that given day, it was the cold nose and the warm heart of that wonderful golden retriever that got that girl to talk in a very low voice, Puppy, come. And so then I knew she could talk, and she knew I knew she could talk. So I said to the parents, forget our introductory meeting. Can you go sit in the other room? And I sat on the floor with the girl, and we interacted gently with Puppy, and we began to talk. And over a course of several months, not only did I get her to talk in my office, but we figured out a way to practice so that she could introduce Puppy to her teacher, because she still wasn't speaking at school. And one afternoon, Puppy went for lunch with her, myself, and her teacher. And it was the first time the teacher heard the young lady speaking. We also did that on a playground with children. Some people ask me, was it really the golden retriever that got her to talk? And what I'm going to strongly say is, I definitely know that she had a tremendous impact. I've worked with many children that are selectively mute, but Puppy was that social catalyst that got that youngster comfortable enough and was able to help with that process. So what's the value in working with therapy animals? And as I said, this is a lot more complicated than just bringing an animal. The animal really needs to be receptive to the handler. Like my dogs and I have worked so long with each other, I almost consider ourselves almost like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, that we've learned to know how to dance with each other, how to work with each other so that we're comfortable. But in many ways, the presence of a therapy animal sometimes can motivate people to do things that they may not want to do. So I've had children that don't want to cooperate, let's say with a therapist in talking, or not wanting to work with a physical therapist or an occupational therapist in cutting, But all of a sudden, when you say, can you cut these soft biscuits for Puppy or for Fido, or can you help me fill up a water bowl? All of a sudden, they're more motivated to do it because of the presence of the animal, doing it for the animal. So motivation, I can share with you so many of the studies that look at getting children and adults to do things, exercise. When we look at seniors and walking, for example, I can share with you the exercise that I've witnessed where seniors that have a chance to walk dogs to practice exercise or just walk on their own, the people that have the opportunity to walk shelter animals are more willing to do that exercise. Again, in my work, take a look at having an animal in your life can enable rapport building. We talked about that social catalyst. In my way of looking at it, animals help me sometimes go under the radar of people's defense mechanisms so that they're more comfortable in interacting. And then, of course, you get things like this engagement. And it's interesting because even in the group activities that I've worked with, it's important to realize that some people would think that the animals would make things more distracting. And it's the other side. The animals bring that sense of calmness to a room, especially when you go and train the humans about the fact that we need to be calmer. And again, I can share so many anecdotes with that. I don't want to use the word hook, but one of the ways that you need to recognize this is that the strongest buy-in that animal-assisted interventions has is this whole notion of the value of human-animal interactions, our innate desire to interact with animals. And as I said, I have not gone into a portion of the health benefits because this evening, Nancy is going to be doing that in much more detail. So we have about 12 to 13 minutes. And if I want to shift the paradigm, where do I see the field going, and where do I see hopefully activities and therapeutic opportunities in Singapore embracing? You know, as much as I am passionate about our connection and our commitment to that warmth, the field of animal-assisted therapy needs more scientific evidence to convince skeptics. We need a better research platform, and we have seen a tremendous growth in research in the last 25 years, partially because we're seeing more funding agencies giving resources to to researchers that are engaging in this manner. So I believe that science must inform practice. And as we talk today with your group, you know, scientific research has always been used to better understand the world around us. It helps demystify, because as much as I'd love to talk about the magic in our relationships, when you really come to talking to policymakers, people that can help open up doors for animal-assisted interventions, they need to understand more evidence. They need to understand that this is beyond just puppy love and cuddles, that we can make a difference in the relationships that we presently have with animals, and we can make a significant difference in inroads in promoting animal-assisted interventions by helping stakeholders and policymakers do a better job. I think that we have to balance then the emotional factors versus the scientific factors. And I think when you blend it together, the good science will help us connect that information to explain how and why animal-assisted interventions are occurring. And when you look at it today, you know, we're seeing research becoming more relevant. And I know that sometimes some of us think of research as being boring, but research hopefully will lead to funding and the opening of frontiers for other opportunities. And so one of the challenges in the field of animal-assisted interventions has been that the research has been extremely flawed. The human-animal interaction research was better developed. We are now seeing more randomized controlled trials, and more sophisticated research designs because of funding that are making a difference. And in fact, the way we are measuring the impact of animal-assisted interventions is so different today than it was when I began in the 70s. In the 70s, it was a lot of anecdotal comments. It was a lot of surveys. But today we see people collecting cortisol. We see people looking at oxytocin. We have heart rate variability, things as simple as having people wear watches that can collect their data on heart rate. We can collect that data on the animals to better understand how this is impacting them, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So one of the areas that I'm really interested in the research that I do is what is called translational research, research that captures what's important not only for research for policymakers, but research that can translate to practice, better practice, so that we can answer the questions that clinicians want to know. Because what you need to recognize is as the field has evolved and become more sophisticated, we need to start answering questions like, what's the best practice that we can apply for a person with autism, which may be different than a best practice of using animals with a person with dementia or a person that's gone through trauma or the issues that are prevalent to that individual. And some people are also trying to figure out what's the best dosage. If I use a medical term, how do we know how much therapy can make a difference? Well, these are the questions that practitioners hopefully will get researchers to answer. I know this is a brief overview that if you want and the group would like, I'd be happy to share some articles that I've written. To me, this conversation could not be given even as short as it is if we don't talk about the animals. These are two of my dogs. You know, when I began my career, I didn't know all the things that I know today. I realized very quickly that this was a major responsibility for me when I brought animals in. They're not toys or objects that people interact with at their pleasure. They're sentient beings that deserve the respect and the care. So I'm excited that over the last 20 years, the field has evolved and we're spending a lot of time looking at therapy animals. In fact, I have a new book coming out in May that will be published by Springer Science that looks at the welfare of therapy animals and what we need to do to preserve this. So you need to realize that as much as we think this may be fun for animals, for some animals, this is very stressful. For some animals, it can be exhausting. They can burn out. And what I've learned over the years is to surround myself with people that have helped me better understand this. So I've worked with people that are animal behaviorists and ethologists that have taught me things so that I know that my animal's welfare is always preserved. My dogs probably are as well cared for as many humans. My dogs get vet checks. They have a dietitian that balances their diet because everyone wants to give treats to my animals. Well, if everyone gave them treats, they'd be as pudgy as I am, and we don't want that. My animals get walked many times a day. They also have people picking them up to take them home, to have breaks. So we need to make that consideration important. And that's where that ethical cost benefit comes. And I know I'm not doing justice with just a few minutes to talk about this, but I wouldn't want you to leave today to say, oh my goodness, animal-assisted interventions is wonderful for humans, because we wouldn't be doing this correctly if we wouldn't talk about that we need to look at both sides of the leash, so to speak. Advances in AAI must consider animal welfare, because animal-assisted interventions wouldn't even exist without the animals. And one way of looking at it is that I believe that our moral responsibility is that no longer should we think, what can our animals do for us in animal-assisted interventions, but what can we do for our animals? So as your country embraces animal-assisted interventions, there really needs to be the balance. How do we not only preserve their welfare while they're working, how do we assure that the animals are well trained? How do we assure that the handler understands the etiology of that animal, the ethology of those behaviors, that we can best help them do their job, but to work with us effectively and share that opportunity. The other whole part of our conversation really can relate to the future of this field. The field has really evolved so much since I began close to 48 years ago. Boris Levinson, even a little longer. The reality is, when I began, people looked at what I did very oddly. If I would walk, some people would smile and go, "Hey, there's the doctor with the dogs and the birds." But today, I think people really have embraced this process. But as we've embraced it, there are people that are doing this work that aren't really well trained in doing animal assisted therapy or animal assisted education or animal assisted activities. So the world is changing now, because we're seeing, and I'll talk a little bit about credentialing in a moment, but we're also seeing that as the field is evolving, leaders are helping us learn, how do you develop protocols or treatment opportunities that best suit certain populations and certain settings. And of course, what's very dear to my heart is, we can't keep this secret in our bottle. We need to be able to talk to policy changers, public policy people that can be influencers, that can help this field grow. So I want to give an example, for example, when I'm talking about professionalism, because I've written about this for decades and talked about that there needs to be a standard that monitors how we competently train the people doing this work. And for sure, how do we make sure that the animals that are doing this work are best suited? Because not every companion animal can do this. And in fact, not only, if we're talking about therapy animals, we need to realize that certain animals do a better job with certain populations. So we need to find the right animal for the right job. In January of 2022, a new organization will be established by Pet Partners. It's a separate organization called the Association for Animal Assisted Intervention Professionals. It will be an organization like the Animal Assisted Intervention International Organization, that's really addressing what can we do to help professionals become more prepared. One of the things that this organization will be sponsoring beginning mid next year is a certification examination that looks at measuring and making sure the people that have and do this work have a certain level of competencies. So I'm sort of coming to the end before I answer a couple of questions. I have about a minute and a half left, but I'd like to, one, thank you for inviting me. It's always a wonderful gift to be able to share the passion from a guy that never even had an animal as a little boy. But I tell you this story. This is not the real child, but it is a real story. I knew a boy years ago. We're going to call him Stephen. And many years ago, Stephen had an opportunity to be invited to a birthday party. And Stephen is about 6, 7 years old. And he runs to his mother and say, "Hey, Mom, can I go to the birthday party? I'm so excited." And Mom said, "Sure." And he said the birthday's Saturday. And for a couple of days, because he didn't know the calendar, he went to his mom and said, "Can you tell me, is it today?" And each day Mom would say, "It's another few days away." But as she told him about the party, she said, "You got to promise me one thing, Stephen," because Stephen had ADHD, "is that when you go, when I tell you it's time to come home, you're going to listen, right?" Because sometimes Stephen, when he would get to a place, he might start to cry or get really agitated when he had to leave. Well, he went to the party, he had a great time. And when his mother told him it's time to leave, he got up, but then he said, "But Mom, I didn't watch her open up the presents. Can I stay for a minute?" And Mom said, "Okay." So the gifts were open. It took a little longer than Mom wanted. And she said, "It's time to leave, Stephen." And he got up, but then he looked at his mom again and said, but Mom, could I just say goodbye? I forgot to say goodbye to her." And Mom scratched her head. She thought that was an honest request. So she watched her little boy walk over to this girl, and he sat down on the ground and he embraced that girl and he said, "Thanks for inviting me. You know, I've never been invited to a birthday party before. This was great. What many of you may not realize is the birthday party wasn't for his little friend that was a human girl. The birthday party was for the therapy dog that was mine, that he came to a birthday party that was really a social skills opportunity. We had close to 60 children that day that came to celebrate with that dog, and how happy he was, but how importantly he learned how to handle his behavior, which was the importance of that process. So, as I leave you, sometimes science has a hard time explaining medical ambiguities and everyday miracles, although I'm hoping that science can really help us better grasp this. You know, Albert Einstein even said once, some things that can be counted, and some things that need to be counted, we can't count because we can't explain it. So I believe that all people deserve a champion. They can become difference makers in people's lives. And I'm hoping that as you embrace the field of animal assisted interventions, you could recognize that that champion can be an animal. It's truly been an honor to be with you this evening, quite late in California now, but the excitement of sharing with you this field has rejuvenated me. So I'm willing to take some questions, but thank you so much for listening. And I'm going to open this up here so I can see all of you, or at least get a chance to see some of you. Okay, go ahead, Audrey.
Thank you, Dr. Fine, for your sharing. It was indeed insightful, and many of us thought so too. Now we will proceed to the Q&A, and thank you to everyone who has sent in your questions, but due to time, shortage of time, we might not be able to get to every single one. So let's go to the first question. Should the animal have a single handler and live with the handler in a home environment instead of living separately in other facilities for the purposes of AI?
That's a hard question. You know, in all of my work, of course, I am the handler, and I've never used other people's animals at all. There are a cohort of people that work collaboratively with handlers, so that's where you can cross discipline. So, for example, I know of some psychologists that work with dog handlers or dog trainers, and the it isn't their animal when they work together, and they still can have this cooperative relationship. Um, so there are many ways to do this work, but in my work, all the animals are my own, and they go home with me. Um, uh, the animals that live at facilities, if there is a person that's totally responsible and delegates responsibility of who's going to exercise, who's going to feed an animal, it's possible to do that work because there are facility animals. But in most of my own clinical work, I do my own training with people helping me, of course, and they go home with me because at nighttime they can be my family companions.
Yep, thank you, Dr. Fine. We'll go to the next question. Can a physical assistant dog for non-ambulant wheelchair users also provide psychotherapy or animal therapy for the handler?
So you're asking the question, could a service dog, I
Yeah.
think can a service dog sometimes be utilized as a therapy dog? Well, yes. In fact, was involved in a very large project with children that had ADHD, and some of the dogs that were involved were service dogs that came and helped out. Service dogs, of course, that are extremely well trained, can have multiple skill sets. Um, so yes, that being said, many animals that are trained to do therapy work have a different form of training. Again, the key issues really are in therapy work that the animal has affiliative nature, that they want to be interactive, and then of course the training and the consistency. I think service animals have a higher level of requirement of what they do, but again, the behavioral correlates and the obedience, if I use that word, are very consistent with therapy animals, that they have to meet that ability because you don't want to get them stressed.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. What qualifications and or experience should a handler have to be able to conduct AAT for the session to be useful, enjoyable, and safe for both parties?
Well, these are really wonderful, wonderful questions that are complicated. Again, when we use the word AAT, the key word number one is that that person is a professional, in the way that I'm looking at more of the medical health professionals. And so, in essence, um, the balance is knowing. And in fact, when I talk about competency, I know that perhaps, you may be a wonderful social worker, I may be a good psychologist, a nurse, or what have you. When you're doing animal assisted interventions, it's the combination of both fields, right? So the way I look at it, people say to me, am I an animal assisted therapist? And, when you think about it, because of the work that I've done over the years, I think I would qualify to say that I'm that, but I'm really a psychologist that has that emphasizes cognitive behavioral therapy. And I look at animal assisted interventions as a form of complementary therapy and how I do that. So I think the training is what I was just talking about. I think that for a person to do this well, and it's a much different era of time than when I began my work. Because you think about it, when I did my work, I was figuring this out as I was going along, because I didn't take a class. I never read a book. I never saw Boris Levenson's book until I did a book review on it. But the reality is today, the platform of animal assisted interventions professionally is much more sophisticated, if I use that word. And there's a lot more evidence that I think a competent handler needs to get the background. So I think that one shouldn't just say, I do this because I've taken one lecture. There's a lot of training that I think we have to get on both the human way of interacting alongside a therapy animal, and also really understanding the animal and his or her needs.
Yep, thank you. Moving on to the next question, could we have your comments on the potential of cat-assisted therapy? What are particular benefits and challenges?
Cat, did you say feline? Okay.
Yeah, feline.
There are people that use cats. Cats are registered therapy animals. There are different species of animals. It's not my specialty. One person that would be a good name, that the person that asked that question, is Dennis Turner. I have some information that I can give them. So Dennis Turner is probably one of the experts that I know on cat behavior. I know a couple of others. Steve Dale would be another. But cats have been used in visiting programs, and for some persons, it works out very well.
I think we've probably only got time for one last question. So it's a bit sensitive, but is it ethical to give an animal a sedative for the purposes of AI?
That was a great question. I would say no right away, because I remember years and years ago, I went somewhere and I met a man that said, I know you're not an animal behaviorist. And he said to me, but, I have a great dog that I love to take to work with me. But every time I bring the dog to the place, the dog throws up. And he said, well, how can I work with this? And I was honest. And I said that maybe the dog's letting you know that this isn't what he or she needs. So I think I gave you the answer. And I think bringing that up as a question is a good question, because I think we need to be more ethically bound, that we are the voice for the animals. So when you think about it, there's an acronym that Pet Partners has. You are your animal's best advocate. So if you're your animal's best advocate, that's why when I work with my animals, they trust me. They've learned that I'm not going to put them in harm's way. And I know I'm being anthropomorphic about that statement, but doing it that way, I feel very confident that I'm not going to put them in situations. So, if a dog's not feeling well, if a dog's super active, you stop. You don't continue that kind of work. And I think that needs to be a high standard of integration. So again, I know that we're out of time, and I'm going to let Audrey say goodbye for me, but really, Singapore, I wish I could be there with you. And as I said, you are my tomorrow morning. So when I wake up in the morning, I'll think about you when I saw you today. So thanks.
Yep. Thank you so much, Dr. Fine, and everyone who submitted the question. We have come to the end of the first session in our webinar on the science of animal-assisted intervention. We hope that you managed to gain some insights into this field and a greater appreciation for the pets around us. Head over to our Facebook page, Animal Buzz SG, for more educational information on animal ethology, and like the page for regular content. Do join us later at 8 p.m. for the second session of the webinar, where we will have Dr. Nancy G, friend of Dr. Fine, to share about the health benefits of companion animals. If you did not manage to register for the later session, you may also view it live by visiting the NParks SG YouTube page or scanning and saving the QR code. Thank you so much, Dr. Fine, and have a good night.
Thanks, guys. Nice to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Are we off?
I think there might be still some participants in the room.
Okay, they're leaving now. Then I'll
Yep.
talk with you for a minute. Then I'll
Yep.
go to bed. You know, I didn't realize that tomorrow morning I have one of these that is going to be done in London at 7 in the morning.
Oh dear.